My name is T.S. Monk, and that stands for Thelonious Sphere Monk, and I'm actually the third. The guy that everyone reveres is actually Thelonious Monk Jr., though for many, many years people thought I was Thelonious Monk Jr., but I'm not. I remember the neighborhood on the other side of Amsterdam Avenue. There were candy stores and all kinds of little shops and lots of tenements. It was a very, very vibrant community. The neighborhood was very, very diverse. I lived on 63rd Street between West End and Amsterdam Avenue. On the block or in the projects, everyone knew everybody. I lived in this tiny little apartment, me and my sister and my parents, on 63rd Street, tiny little tiny. So tiny that it's folklore today that Thelonious Monk had his piano in his kitchen. The piano was in the kitchen, but the living room was in the kitchen, and part of the one of the bedrooms was in the kitchen, and everything was in the kitchen because the apartment was so small. On 64th Street, right across from the entrance to the parking lot, there was a poultry house. 63rd Street is a dead-end street. And by the way, now it's called Thelonious Sphere Monk Circle. But right at the top of the circle, there was this guy, Mike, who had been there. He must have been there for 20 years before I was born. And he had a little cart with candy, all kinds of penny candy. He was like the nicest guy. And you know, for a nickel, you could get a whole bag of chocolates or a whole bag of Tootsie Rolls. What I do remember is that although Mike was white, there was no problem with Mike being a white man in the midst of this black community selling candy to all us kids. The diversity within the neighborhood, beyond America, so to speak, was accepted. The city had a program where they would bring movie projectors in to either the playground or the top of 63rd Street and set up a giant screen, and the whole community would come out and watch movies on summer nights. There was and I think there's still a firehouse around the corner. Thelonious was a mascot for that firehouse. He was very, very proud of that. Within the projects, there were several community centers that we would gather in. Kids would play games. 61st Street, there was what we called the Boat and Barrels. And what it was a play area that all of us kids would go to. We spent hours and hours in the boats and barrels in the projects. That was a real hangout. And then of course there was the playground on 63rd Street. At 59th Street there was a public pool that we used to all swim in. That's where I learned to swim, was the public pool on 59th Street between Amsterdam and West End Avenue. There was all this stuff that you could do, and the community seemed to end at 65th Street and 59th Street. They ultimately built Lincoln Towers on West End Avenue, and that's when we became like the Jeffersons, and it was about moving on up. But my father was so locked in, he loved this neighborhood so much that when he finally made enough money to at least move out of the tiny apartment in 63rd Street, we moved 2 blocks up the avenue. We didn't go anywhere. And there was a bar on the corner of 64th Street called Pat's Bar that my father grew up with. And that's where all his friends, his high school friends, and that's where they would hang out. And he still had access to Pat's Bar, so I knew he was really, really, really happy. There were a bunch of musicians in the community. Everyone beat a path to his door. My father had his phone number and his address in the Yellow Pages his entire life. If you wanted to find Frank Sinatra, good luck. But if you wanted to find Thelonious Monk, just pick up the Yellow Pages, and there was his address, and there was his phone number, and you could just go walk right up to his door. And I've talked to a number of very, very substantial musicians that's exactly what they did. They said, I want to meet Monk, and they just knock on the door, and Thelonious would open the door, and you knew Monk. I decided I wanted to play the drums, so I just started playing music at school. When I got to be 15, I told my father, I think I want to play the drums. His take on music with me and my sister, but she was 4 years younger than me, so it was more about me at the time. He only said two things to me. You need to study, and you're late. Because I think in his wisdom and knowing how tough a career in music could be, he wanted to make sure that I was getting into music, not because of him, not because of what people said around me, but because I wanted to be a musician. Thelonious Monk, one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, said absolutely nothing to his son about music from the day I said, I want to play the drums, until 5 years later. And the next thing he said to me about the subject of music, and I'm talking nothing. Did you practice? Did you study? Do you like what you're doing? Nothing. Until he said, are you ready to play? And that week, I joined his band. I was all enthusiastic. I just ran to be in his band. First of all, at the time, he was using one of the great bass players in jazz, a gentleman by the name of Reggie Workman, who had played with Coltrane, played with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, played with everybody. And he sort of guided me as to the responsibilities of being in the rhythm section. Of course, the piano is part of the rhythm section, so my father technically was part of the rhythm section, but I learned very quickly something that all the great drummers that worked with my father learned, which was that you don't keep the time the way you would ordinarily for a band. Monk keeps the time. He does it in a way that you have no choice but to follow his time. But Thelonious had perfect time. Like you've heard of perfect pitch? Mm-hmm. Thelonious had perfect pitch. He also had perfect time. But this is what is important, and this is why I say it was weird. And I discussed this with the drummers that had preceded me also. When I got in the band, I remember saying to my father, Daddy, are we going to rehearse? And he looked at me like I was crazy. And he said, you know the music, don't you? And so I said, well, yeah. And that was the end of that discussion. So there was no rehearsal. With Thelonious Monk, as with the Miles Davises and the John Coltranes and the great ones, it's trial by fire. And this is why I'm so grateful to my dad, because he didn't, you could say he gave me special treatment in that he just asked me to join his band when an opening was created and he'd fired somebody. He said, come on with me. Okay, that's a father's prerogative. But beyond that, it was the same trial by fire that I discussed with Max Roach and Art Blakey and all these guys and said, when you play with Monk, you just hit. There was no rehearsal. You found yourself on the bandstand and he'd start playing a tune and your job was just hit it. I had a lot of fun with my father. When you perform or interact with genius, real genius, like Einstein, like Ptolemy, like Beethoven, like Monk, real genius, when you interact with it, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter that you're his son. The genius rubs off on you and it changes you for life. And that's what Thelonious Monk did for me, and that's what I'm eternally grateful. And everything from where I grew up down the block there, he was right. It was an important place to grow up. I mean, that's just a small remnant that's left of the community, because what they knocked down to build Lincoln Center was a whole community. I mean, it was a lot of people, it was a lot of buildings, and we looked at it as urban renewal, except we called it urban removal. Building Lincoln Center was kind of an affront to the community. You know, I'm kind of like a bottom line guy. I always say I got to meet my father on the other side, and so I got to tell the truth all the time. It was not built for us. We felt it was being built for the classical community, and it was built for a demographic of which we were not a part. And there was no real connection between Lincoln Center and the community across the street. My father, he used to say it was appropriate that they were going to build this Lincoln Center thing in this community. At the time, I didn't really know why, because I wasn't that familiar with either his personal history or the history of the community. But now that I am, he was right. I mean, I knew about, you know, like people like James P. Johnson living in the buildings that we lived in, and I knew that the 63rd Street Theater was over here with, you know, Noble Sissel and U.B. Blake had mounted Shuffle Along, which was sort of the quintessential American musical. But I didn't know much beyond that. I didn't know the Nina Simones and all the other artisans that lived in this community. You know, my father was a real bright guy. Now it all makes sense. Thelonious, he felt like there could be no better place for Lincoln Center than right here in the heart of San Juan Hill. The fact that he actually ended up playing here and ended up being the first artist to record here all must have meant an awful lot to him. And I'm delighted that I'm here today as a result of a new mindset at Lincoln Center that, hey, this cultural center is built in a historical community, and we have to have a connection with that community. It's so appropriate. I think that that's what my father was hoping for. All the murals on the side of Geffen Hall, I say, wow, man, wow. Monk's picture is up there. Nina Simone's picture is up there. It matters. This is what my father was looking for 50, 60 years ago when Lincoln Center was built. He knew that this should be the connection. If this mentality can be sustained, this is going to be good for the community, for Lincoln Center, for New York City, and ultimately for the world. The diversity of San Juan Hill, the diversity of New York, to me, really reflects what this country aspires to be.